Awesome. Welcome everybody to the Starlite Recovery Center CEU webinar for November. We are thrilled to have this topic today and have the Jason Foundation join us, Cory Watkins. He's been on our webinars before, and he's a wealth of information about suicide prevention for our heroes in the community. So let me turn it over to you, Cory.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric. I really appreciate the opportunity to present again with you and this wonderful group and audience you always bring on with these trainings. My name is Cory Watkins. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Jason Foundation. If you're not familiar with the Jason Foundation, we are a nonprofit based out of Hendersonville, Tennessee, just northeast of Nashville. But we are a national organization with over 160 offices all across the country that reach out to their community with the Jason Foundation suicide prevention resources, Starlite being one of these community outreach offices in Texas there. So really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. What we're going to be talking about today, just to give you some expectations. For my portion of the presentation this afternoon, today is really meant to raise your awareness. This is going to be kind of a two-part presentation on my end. It's going to be suicide prevention in the community, recognizing those in the community who are struggling, and as a first responder, what you might be able to do to assist. And then it's going to be suicide prevention within the first responder community. Recognizing a peer, recognizing a coworker, a fellow first responder who might be struggling, who might be in need, and the importance of having that help-seeking behavior, the importance of assisting those peers getting the help that they need, recognizing when they're struggling. So today is really meant to raise your awareness of the issue, give you a base knowledge of the problem we're facing, and then educating you on how to impact that issue, what you can do to make an impact on this issue of suicide. It's not meant to make you a crisis counselor. This is not meant to make you an expert in the field of suicide prevention. Again, it's meant to raise your awareness and give you an education on what you can do to prevent this from occurring. So I want to start my presentation with a quote. So this is a quote from the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization says the prevention of suicide has not been adequately addressed due to basically a lack of awareness of suicide as a major health problem. So essentially, the World Health Organization is saying we haven't done enough to impact this issue of suicide, to address the problem of suicide, because not enough people know how big of an issue it is. It goes back to the old adage, you don't know what you don't know. If you don't know that there is a problem, you won't educate yourself on the things that you should look for on how to prevent that problem from occurring. So that first step in prevention is awareness, knowing that there's a problem, understanding that there's an issue that we're dealing with in society and within our communities. I want to share some statistics with you. 2020 is the last year that we have statistics on. Typically, the CDC and other organizations, we run a couple years behind on gathering statistics. But we know in 2020, we lost almost 46,000 individuals to suicide in the United States. Almost 46,000 individuals we lost to suicide. 1.2 million Americans attempted suicide. 54% of us were affected by it. Over half of the population were affected at some point by suicide in 2020. That means whether that's someone within our family, someone we know, someone within our community, over half of us were impacted by suicide. Of those individuals that died by suicide, 46 had a diagnosable mental health condition, and 90% had experienced symptoms of a mental health condition. That's an important factor. That's an important thing to remember. Now, every year the CDC comes out with a list of leading causes of death, whether that's a 1 through 10, 1 through 12, a list of these leading causes of death that impact our community. Suicide is ranked number 12. It's the 12th leading cause of death in the United States. You may hear that and you may think, well, that's not as bad as I expected. You know, I expected it to be much higher. We're doing a whole training on this issue. We hear about it. That's all age groups. So that's your newborns to your elderly, everywhere in between, 12th leading cause of death. It's really when you start to narrow these age groups down, you start to pinpoint specific ages, you see the gravity and the impact of the issue we're dealing with. Let's look at this together. Look at that 10 to 14-year-olds. Suicide is the third leading cause of death. Third most likely thing to take our young people's lives, 10 to 14 is suicide. Same thing for our high school students, college age, starting careers, starting their young adult lives, 15 to 24, suicide again is the third most likely thing to take someone's life. And then if you look at from the young adult to a middle-aged population, 25 to 40, suicide is the second leading cause of death. Second most likely thing to take someone's life. So that 12th overall can be misleading because if you look at specific age groups, you see the gravity and the impact of this issue. Second leading cause of death for 20 to 40-year-olds. Now, there's a survey that the CDC gives out called the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey. It's given out to high school students, 9th through 12th grade, asks a broad range of behavioral questions, lots of questions about bullying, about drugs, about alcohol, mental health. And there's one question that asks them if they have made a plan for suicide in the last year. There's one question that says, have you made a plan to attempt suicide in the last year? Now, the reason that this question is important and why we're looking at numbers for high school students, because this is a good barometer of where our young people are at and where our young adults are going to be. 15.7% of our high school youth reported that in the last year, they have made a plan. Now, if we know if there's a plan in place, if that individual has a how, a when, a where, really they're in a crisis stage, right? They're in a crisis stage that if something's not done to intervene in that plan, to change that train of thought, an attempt could be inevitable. 15.7% of our high school students said that in the last year, they have essentially been in a crisis stage. Another question asked them about, have you attempted suicide? 8.9% of our youth said they have attempted suicide in the last year. This is a significant issue that is affecting our young people and our young adults across the nation. Now, overall, each week in our nation, we lose about 850 to what we call the silent epidemic of suicide. 850 individuals every single week we lose to suicide. Now, we call it the silent epidemic because we're really losing individuals in epidemic proportions, but it's not having the focus and the attention that frankly it needs to make an impact on the issue, to make an impact on how to prevent it. I want to share some more facts with you. We know that women and girls, young girls are more likely to attempt suicide than men. Now, of course, this says why here, but I'm not going to ask you on a webinar to pop in the chat function and tell us why you think this is. I do this presentation live all over the country, and in doing this presentation live, I asked this question. I asked the audience, why do you think this is? Why do you think women are more likely to attempt suicide than men? I've had all sorts of answers, anywhere from women are more in touch with their emotions, more likely to act upon those emotions. Young girls have to deal with peer pressure more than boys do. There's all sorts of answers I've heard as to why people think this is the case. The real answer to this question, we don't know. There's a lot of different factors that go into it. A lot of different circumstances that apply. There's not a single thing we can pinpoint as to say, hey, this is the reason. Another fact, and unfortunately we do know the reason for this, and that is men are over 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide. 3.5 times more likely to die. You can probably think of the reason in your head right now, and that is choice of means. Historically, women, young girls have chosen less lethal methods of attempts, whereas men usually choose firearms. And with firearms, a window of opportunity is really, in most cases, not there, or it's significantly reduced. So that's the main reason why we're seeing men dying by suicide at a much higher rate than women. But there has been a change. There has been a trend. And really, this is very significant within our young women, within our young girls, this trend that they're starting to change their choices of means to more lethal methods. And if they're attempting suicide more often, 1.5 times more often than men. If they're now changing their choice of means to more lethal methods, we're going to see, really, as we've seen, that gap between men and women start to close in, and this suicide rate and this issue of suicide continue to rise across the country. So what do we do? What can be done? You know, one of the biggest myths surrounding suicide prevention is people say, hey, it's an impulsive act. It's impulsive. What do we do to stop it? Something happens in that individual's life and an attempt shortly follows. There's nothing I can do to prevent it. When in fact, we know in most cases that's really not true. Mental Health America did a study where they found 4 out of 5 individuals considering suicide give some sign of their intentions. That might be verbally, might be behaviorally, but that means in 80% of those individuals, we have an opportunity to recognize their struggles, to recognize their pain and intervene, get them the help that they need. We know suicide is a leading cause of death. 3rd leading cause of death for our young people in this nation. 2nd leading cause of death for our young adults and our middle-aged adults in this nation. But it's a leading cause of preventable death. Because in most cases, we have an opportunity to recognize that individual who is struggling, recognize that individual who is dealing with something, and get them the help that they need. Leading cause of preventable death. What can we do? Remember, number one, that first thing we can do is raise awareness. If you don't know there's a problem, you won't educate yourself on how to prevent it. First step is increasing awareness. Second step is dispelling myths like suicide's impulsive, when in fact we know in most cases that's not true. In most cases, there are signs evident that we can recognize. Another myth is if you talk to someone about suicide, that'll put the thought into their head. That's a myth. Luckily, it's not a myth that is very widely held any longer, but you know, we have still heard it from time to time. Talking to someone about suicide will not make them more likely to attempt. If anything, it can show them that somebody cares about them. It'll give them an avenue to open up and talk about their issues, talk about their struggles and their pain and the weight that they're carrying. It will not make them more likely to attempt suicide. And education, learning what to look out for, learning those elevated risk factors, those signs of concern that we can recognize in individuals who might be struggling. And we'll talk a little bit more about specific signs of concerns for first responders. But these are just general signs that you might be able to recognize in the community as a first responder or just a general member of the community, what you can look out for in your loved ones, what you can look out for in those around you. Signs of concern, number one, suicide threats. That's obvious, right? Somebody comes up to us, says, hey, I'm going to kill myself. Hey, I'm thinking about suicide. We take that serious. We take that serious that person's really struggling and needs help. You know, that's abrupt. That's in your face. It may not be that way. Maybe subtle, like soon you won't have me around to deal with. What's the point of living? I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. Whether it's an abrupt, in-your-face threat or a more subtle, we should take those just as serious. Just as serious. Previous suicide attempts. Individuals with a history of suicidal behavior, frankly, are at a higher risk. They're at a higher risk to attempt again in the future. Depression, mental illness. You know, that slide, that stat on one of the first slides in the presentation today showed that 46% had been diagnosed, 90% had shown signs of mental health issues, depression, mental illness. Not everybody that's depressed is suicidal. Not everybody that struggles with mental illness is suicidal. That's not what I'm saying, not what I'm trying to project. But depression and mental illness is one of the leading factors associated with suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior. So it's something to be very concerned about. Final arrangements. Really, we see this in a few ways. We see this in giving away prized possessions. Maybe something someone holds dear, cherishes, a family heirloom, jewelry, sports memorabilia, cell phone. Those things that they cherish that are part of their everyday life, integrated into who they are. Giving those possessions away could signify that a plan is in place and they feel like they're not going to need these possessions any longer. Another final arrangement is, making funeral plans. Making funeral plans for someone who's seemingly in perfectly good health. If they seem like they're trying to tell people how they want their funerals to go as if it were going to be happening soon. Another final arrangement is making rounds. Either that is making things right with certain individuals, saying goodbye. You know, the Jason Foundation, one of our primary focuses and the reason we began is youth and young adult suicide prevention. We're named after Jason Flatt, our president and founder's son, who he lost to suicide at the age of 16. And one of our biggest focuses is the prevention of suicide within our youth population. And you would be shocked how often we hear about a young person dying by suicide, and we hear about them telling someone. We hear that they've told someone what they were going to do, how they were going to do it, when they were going to do it. They told a friend, and that friend didn't do anything. That friend didn't speak up, didn't say anything. Doesn't mean that friend is bad. Doesn't mean that they're a bad kid or had bad intentions by any means. In most cases, it's deer in the headlights. They don't know what to do. They're caught off guard. They're shocked. So important to educate our young people the importance of speaking up and knowing where to go for help. And then I have character behavior, simply acting different as you know them. These are just some examples. I'll go into this a little bit more in detail in just a little bit for time's sake. Just want to leave this on your screen here. That might be changes in eating and sleeping habits. Lack of interest in withdrawal can be a big one, a significant one. Preoccupation with death and suicide. Basically, if someone's acting differently from how you know them, that could be a sign that they're struggling with something. Might not be suicide, might not be thoughts of suicide, but could be that they're struggling with depression, anxiety, feeling overwhelmed, and might just need someone to talk to. Risk factors. These are a combination of situations that might lead someone to consider suicide. Not necessarily a direct cause, but can increase the risk. Social isolation. Right off the bat, you know, over the last 2 years, how many of us does that describe? You know, a lot of us have dealt in some part with a form of social isolation, especially our young people. Whether that is the shutdown of schools, whether it's 2020 where jobs went virtual, where a lot of our typical access to resources were interrupted and our social support system might have been interrupted. That social isolation can be very devastating for mental health. It's also those individuals that don't have a social support system, that don't have those close friends or family members or individuals in their life that they can lean upon if they're struggling. They're isolated. Mental illness, we talked about that being one of the leading factors associated with suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors. Other issues like serious illness, bullying, sexual violence, substance use issues, family history of suicide. These are elevated risks. Again, not necessarily a direct cause, but can increase one's risk for suicidal behavior. So what do? How can you increase awareness in your community? Well, as a first responder, if you are a first responder or just a general member of your community, encourage those around you to get trained. Encourage those around you to educate themselves. Educate themselves on the statistics, on the signs of concern, and what to look for in their loved ones. That awareness and education are two very key important steps in preventing this issue. Encourage those around you. Maybe that is if you're a member of a church, if you're a member of a civic organization, of a group within your community, Chamber of Commerce, encourage them to have someone come in and speak. We are always happy to do those trainings. We're always happy to assist. We have other trainings, virtual, live, on our website that you can stream, a lot of different opportunities that you can utilize to educate yourself and those in your community. If you're part of a school system, encourage your school system to incorporate suicide prevention training, not only for their teachers, but also for their students. We have a curriculum that can be utilized for this, that they can access to educate their young people, especially within our youth. They're usually the first to recognize a friend who is in trouble. So educating our young people on how to recognize a friend and knowing where to go for help is so important. If you're a first responder, educate your school resource officers. Get them engaged, get them involved and understanding what to look for in the youth that they interact with on a daily basis. Briefly, before I get to some of the first responder information, I want to talk about our programs. Jason Foundation has programs intended to reach the community on this issue, to educate the community on how to recognize and intervene in those individuals who are struggling with thoughts of suicide. All of our programs are free. Any pass out materials, curriculum, training videos, educational materials you might need, you can access at absolutely no charge. Starlite is one of our Jason Foundation offices who can provide you programs for free. Of course, we at Jason Foundation Corporate Office can do the same as well. We have a parent resource program, which is just a website that you can go and encourage parents in your community to educate themselves on how to recognize their children who are struggling, how to have that conversation with them as well. Our B1 program is essentially a peer-to-peer program, educating young people to recognize a friend who is struggling. Our first responder training, similar to what I'm doing today, we have this on DVD. We have it also streaming from our website that you can access at any time for free. And our Friend Ask smartphone app is really meant to provide resources at your fingertips. It goes through those signs of concern. It goes through how to help a friend in need, what to say, do's and don'ts. And that Get Help Now can connect to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Very important. Having these resources at your fingertips can save lives. I want to talk a little bit about the first responder community now, specifically. Oftentimes we see a traumatic event like a suicide, like the death of a young person, like the suicide of someone in our community, and we see how that affects the family and friends and those immediately impacted and associated with that individual. But so oftentimes what goes unnoticed, what goes unlooked, what goes unseen is the first responder who is responding to that traumatic call. We don't think about how that event is affecting that first responder, who are the first on the scene of those events, and probably several more throughout the course of their careers. And I want to kind of kick this off with a quote from Dr. Remen. He said, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as being able to walk through water without getting wet." Essentially, she's saying we can't expect our first responders to experience these traumas and these stressful events on a regular basis and it have no effect on them. That is unrealistic. That's an unrealistic expectation. And I want to share some statistics with you. And then I know Melissa is going to be sharing some stats with you as well, and much more information on this. But I just want to kind of give you a base knowledge of what we're dealing with. Do you know we're losing more police officers, firefighters, and EMS to suicide than in the line of duty? We lose more to suicide than in the line of duty. In fact, in 2020, we lost, in the line of duty, we lost 119 officers to suicide. Line of duty, 119. Suicide, we lost 186. Firefighters, over double. 62 line of duty deaths, 123 firefighters and EMS we lost to suicide. We're losing much more first responders to suicide than we're losing in the line of duty. In fact, suicide takes 2 to 3 times the number of officers' lives than being killed by a felon. And the risk of suicide for police officers especially is 54% greater than the general American worker. Now, there are some police officers are higher risk for suicide. Some things might contribute to that, like their access to weapons, their intense stress that they go through, their being exposed to suffering and loss on a regular basis. Those can contribute to issues that first responders deal with at a higher risk than, or a higher rate than the general population. Some of these issues are acute stress disorder, PTSD, depression. The rates that our first responders deal and struggle with these issues are at a higher rate than the general population. I want to talk about each of these a little bit more in detail. Acute stress disorder, this can be something following a person's exposure with one or more traumatic events. Events like a violent call that involves homicide, child abuse, experience great loss or suffering, chasing an individual on foot. You might see these and you might think that it sounds a lot like what can cause PTSD. And you would be correct that there are some similarities, but it's really some of the differences that are key and so important. With acute stress disorder, this is something that can be diagnosed right away, 0 to 30 days. PTSD, 1 month after the trauma occurs, it can be diagnosed. Difference in how long it can last. ASD can last 3 days to 4 weeks. PTSD, months, persisting over several years. Treatment, acute stress disorder can be short-term. PTSD can be long-term. And I want to show you the differences here because oftentimes acute stress disorder, if left undiagnosed, if left untreated, it can possibly turn into PTSD. So it's so important to recognize our peers, recognize our fellow first responders who are struggling right after a trauma, right after a traumatic event or a stressful call. If you recognize they're struggling, it's important to encourage them to seek help because it can be something that they can get help with and overcome in a short period of time versus something that if it turns into PTSD can be more persistent and last longer, be more difficult to overcome. For PTSD and depression rates among firefighters and EMS, it's been found to be more than double that of the civilian population. For police officers, over 5 times the civilian population. And just to put some numbers behind this, about 6% of the general population suffers from PTSD. About 6%. For firefighters and EMS, it's been found as much as 22% suffer from PTSD. And then police officers, it's been found as much as 35% suffer from PTSD. Research found that elevated levels of PTSD are associated with alcoholism, drug abuse, relationship problems, depression, higher likelihood of thinking about suicide or having a history of suicide attempts. Now, we worked with an organization called Status Code 4 out of Colorado when we developed our first responders training module. And one thing that they say depression is a silent killer in first responders because it builds up slowly and it goes unnoticed due to constant work-related fatigue. You know, the average first responder we're losing to suicide is not the new recruit. It's not the individual that is fresh on the job and seeing these traumatic events and these stressful calls for the first time. You know, right now, the average first responder we're losing to suicide is 16 years. 16 years on the force, 16 years with the department. It's your seasoned veteran. Your seasoned veteran are the average first responders we're losing to suicide because they have these traumas and these experiences built up. And it gets to a point to where coping mechanisms break down. It's important to encourage your fellow first responders to seek help, encourage that help-seeking behavior, encourage your fellow first responders to look out for their peers, who might be struggling. Some symptoms of depression that you might be able to look out for: changes in sleeping patterns, difficulty thinking, lack of interest and withdrawal. You know, we see this one a lot. If someone is losing interest in the things or the people that they love, they're starting to isolate themselves from activities, isolate themselves from coworkers, isolate themselves from their loved ones. That can be a major sign that something's going on. Something's going on that they need help with. Changes in mood, thoughts of death or suicide. We know first responders are trained to deal with individuals in a mental health crisis within their community, trained to deal with how to approach and how to work along with that individual who's in the midst of that mental health crisis. But do you necessarily put that training inwards towards your fellow first responders? So oftentimes, it may be up to you to recognize they're struggling. You might be the only person in their life who has those shared experiences, who understands what they're going through, who can relate to their pain and their struggles. It's so important as a first responder to look out for your peers because you might be the one to recognize they're struggling. Some critical warning signs might be neglecting their hygiene, neglecting their appearance. Maybe they're openly discussing that they feel out of control. Maybe they're displaying behavioral changes, appearing hostile, blaming, argumentative, passive, defeated, talking about suicide or death, or even glorifying death. You know, another myth around suicide prevention, people will say, you know, that individual, they just talk about it a lot. They're not really at risk. They're just trying to do it to get attention. You know, they just talk about suicide. They draw these dark images. That's just who they are. You know, they're not really at risk. That's a myth. If they're talking about suicide, if they're glorifying death, chances are they're thinking about it even more. That individual is at risk. Giving those direct verbal cues, I wish I were dead, I'm going to end it all. Direct suicide threats, indirect verbal cues, soon you won't have me around to deal with. What's the point of living? Who would care if I'm dead anyway? Again, if it's direct in your face, or if it is subtle, indirect, we need to take those just as seriously. Self-isolation, you know, this is something that's brought up time and time again because it's something we see. Self-isolation from coworkers, family, and friends. Isolation, withdrawal, critical warning sign. Maybe they're exhibiting reckless behavior, carrying their weapons in an unsafe manner. Their job performance is deteriorating. Recent issues with alcohol or drug abuse. Expressing that life is meaningless, life is hopeless. Giving away cherished possessions, giving away prized possessions, that can be a critical warning sign. And this last one can really be confusing. It can really be a little bit misleading. Exhibiting a sudden and unexplained improvement in mood after being depressed or withdrawn. Oftentimes we might see someone who we recognize has been withdrawn, isolating. Maybe you feel like they've been struggling with depression, or you recognize some out of character behaviors, and then all of a sudden they've snapped out of it. They seem to overnight improved in their mood. They seem to finally have gotten through it, and that can be so misleading. You might think that they're good to go now. I don't have to worry about them anymore. Sometimes this can be the result of that individual having a plan in place, feeling that the end is near, and that weight that they've been carrying is lifted off, and that changes their mood. That weight being lifted off lifts their mood, and it can really be something that can be confusing and misleading. But it's important to recognize if they've been struggling, recognize if they've been dealing with something, and ask them if they're okay. Make sure that they're okay, and see if they need help. Be prepared to ask the tough questions. Again, you might be the only person in their life to realize they're struggling. You might be the only person in their life to recognize that they need help, to recognize that they're going through something. And it's important to speak up. Listen carefully. Again, you can be abrupt. You know, asking the tough questions is a difficult thing to do, right? It's a difficult subject to bring up, but be abrupt. It's okay to say, hey, are you thinking about suicide? I recognize some things that have been going on. Is everything okay? Do you want to talk about it? Be supportive, not judgmental. The fear of judgment is thick. The fear of judgment is heavy, especially with a topic like suicide. Being scared someone's going to judge you for it is a very difficult thing to overcome. So listening without judgment is so important. Listening without judgment. Take it very seriously. It can validate what the issues they're going through are. Don't say something like, well, you know, if you think you got it bad, wait till you hear what's going on with me. Don't do that. That can be, it will invalidate their issues. It will make them feel like you don't actually care about what they're going through, and you're not listening to them. Just be there to listen to them. Be a sounding board for them. You don't have to be a counselor. You don't have to talk them out of what they're going through. Just your willingness to listen can help rekindle hope. And can make all the difference. What do you do if you feel fellow first responders at risk? Don't leave them. If you feel like they're in immediate risk, if they're in immediate danger of harming themselves, stay with them. Stay with them until you can get them professional help, or you can get them to someone who can get them professional help. Maybe offering to go with them to your department's contact. Making that first initial step is extremely scary and extremely intimidating, but having a support there, having a support system to encourage you in making that first initial step can be life-saving. Offer to go with them to your department's contact. Offer to be that support that they may need. It's important to learn your department's protocol. When you recognize a fellow first responder might be struggling, it's important to know what to do. You know, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, I'm thinking about suicide, don't get caught off guard. Don't get caught without knowing what your next step should be. Know what the protocol is. Know what protocol's in place. Maybe that's knowing who to contact within your department, knowing what resources are available to you so that you can in turn know where to turn that individual, where to send that individual, who to reach out to for that fellow first responder. There's some great national resources. Of course, 988 Suicide Prevention Lifeline is a wonderful resource that is easily accessible. You can text badge to 741-741, or you can text with crisis counselors 24/7. Doesn't have to be for suicide. It can be for struggles at your job, struggles with mental health, issues with your family. These crisis counselors are available to talk you through 24/7. There's a Safe Call Now, which is a 24/7 crisis referral for first responders and families. There's apps, peer-to-peer, Relate apps, the React training programs. There's resources nationally that you can access. I know departments have resources, counties have resources, states have resources as well for their first responders. Know what those resources are. Oftentimes there are anonymous resources as well. Just know what's available to you, what you can access, and what you can refer your fellow first responders to. It's important for the culture, changing the culture around mental health, changing the culture around suicide, specifically for first responders, eliminating that stigma. There's a huge stigma around mental health for the first responder community. Whether that is having an open dialogue within your department, having this conversation of, hey, there might be mental health repercussions of working as a first responder. That's okay. We can talk this through. Supporting help-seeking behavior, normalizing those help-seeking behaviors that, hey, this is something we might deal with, but this is something we can get help for. Think of these PTSD. You see that disorder and you hear that disorder and the negative connotation that comes with that. Think of this as an injury of the psyche. And if you get appropriate diagnosis and appropriate treatment, you can overcome that injury. Just like if you were to break your arm, you wouldn't just push that off and say, you know what, I'm going to tough it out. I'm going to suck it up. I'm not going to let it affect me. I'm just going to push straight through it. I can overcome this on my own. No, you need diagnosis. You need treatment to have that bone heal. Just with injuries of the mind, injuries of the psyche, injuries with mental health, struggles with mental health, you can get treatment. You can overcome these issues. Encourage your fellow first responders to seek help when needed. Really is something that needs to come from top-down leadership. From leadership to validate the issues the first responders are struggling with, and that will in turn validate the solutions they can utilize to address those issues. So important that it comes from leadership to address the issues and offer resources and solutions to those issues. If we have stronger responders, we have stronger support for our community. Encourage our fellow first responders, encourage those within your community, if they're struggling, to get help for themselves. Basic rule to remember: if you have any doubt about somebody's intentions, if you have concerns about their behavior, seek professional help for them. Seek professional help immediately. Don't wait till you say, you know what, if I see this other sign, if I see a couple more things that are alarming, I'll get help. No, if you have doubt right now, seek professional help for that individual immediately. My final slide, I just want to leave you with some resources that you can access. Suicide Prevention Lifeline, crisis text lines. These are great resources that you can access 24/7. If you're struggling, if you're feeling a fellow first responder is struggling, or someone within your community that you need help, that you need advice on how to assist them, these resources are great for you to access anytime. And of course, the Jason Foundation, again, we are here to provide programs and resources to your community at no charge. If you're interested in trainings, if you're interested in materials that you can utilize within your community, please reach out to me, reach out to Eric, reach out to Starlite. We are here to provide those resources to you wherever you need, whatever you might need. So I want to thank you for allowing me to speak with you. And I know Melissa, Eric, I don't know if you want to do the transition here, but I appreciate the time.
Man, awesome information. Thank you so much, Cory. You are so passionate about this, and we are just really thrilled to partner with the Jason Foundation. And thanks for all you do, and all the resources there at the end. That's awesome. And a lot of times the first kind of phase in that is trying to self-medicate. And so the part 2 of our presentation today is going to be by Melissa Robbins. She is a master's level addiction counselor and also trained in trauma, EMDR. But before that, she actually has firsthand experience as a paramedic and a firefighter. So she comes from experience and even experienced some trauma situations on the job herself. So I'm thrilled to turn it over to Melissa Robbins. But before that, I'm going to post links on the chat box of the program that she is the lead counselor for at Starlite, and also a resource from Acadia Healthcare. That's our parent company, and we actually have some liaisons that can help reach out and work with first responders one-on-one. These are former police chiefs that know what they're going through, and the culture and the language. And so I'm going to post that link here in a minute for good old Joe and Bill that are glad to help anybody anywhere, and they're great. A great resource. So let me turn it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you. Let me see if I can get fired up here. So welcome, everybody. I would love it if you would take a few seconds and really look at this piece of artwork. I stumbled across it when I was looking for something to motivate a client who truly believed that he didn't have PTSD. This is from Dan's son Photo Art. My understanding is that he is an active medic and firefighter in Canada. And he does, all his artwork is on the job type artwork. So what struck me was the look on the officer's face as the people are trying to save him, but the anger and the shame and the fear were doing the very best to grab a hold of him. If anyone has had PTSD, I think you can identify with this photo. So I'd like to talk a minute about how trauma works in the brain. We know that PTSD can develop after an event, any event that the individual finds traumatic. It does not have to be violent. Quite often they are human-caused disasters, nature, combat. The biggest symptoms we probably see at Starlite, nightmares, intrusive memories, the numbness, and it's hard to separate when someone's been drinking for 20 years. What's PTSD and what is their substance use disorder? Dr. Gabor Mate feels that most substance use disorders are directly related to untreated or undertreated trauma. And we find that here at Starlite. The fight or flight is causing an alarm in your brain. Your brain then and your adrenal glands dump cortisol. Your prefrontal cortex is supposed to be a braking system. Your amygdala fires up like a foot on a gas pedal all the way to the floor. And the medial prefrontal cortex becomes hypoactive. So for anyone that has PTSD, your fight or flight is responding way too strongly to whatever the situation is. And it may be active all the time. I just had a gentleman who, if he sees any type of bag or package on the side of the road, because of his combat experiences, he will almost wreck his vehicle getting in the other lane to get away from it. And his brain is telling him this is what he has to do to stay safe. For first responders, substance use disorder usually begins just as a way to blow off steam and build camaraderie, self-medicate. As the use disorder continues, the brain becomes reliant upon the large dumps of dopamine, which is our feel-good neurotransmitter. With the continued use, when you try to stop, the anti-reward system called CRF is trying to counterbalance all that dopamine because the brain was not designed to take those huge dumps. So then the brain realizes that it can't maintain homeostasis, and it actually changes the set point, which they believe causes the tolerance and the cravings, as a way of alerting you that, hey, I need this large dump of dopamine. Things are not working right, even though things are working exactly like the brain was supposed to work. Relapse in the first responder usually happens one of three ways. The re-exposure to the drug, whether that's voluntary or involuntary. If it's voluntary, a drink after work, a pill to go to sleep. If it's involuntary, they get a shot in the ER after breaking their leg. Exposure to drug cues. Everybody on shift is going out after shift to have a drink or two. And because that's where the officer or the medic used to do all their drinking, now the brain tells them, this is what you need to do. It releases glutamate, which shuts down the no-go system and allows the go system to take over. And then the worst, I think, is exposure to environmental stress. Nobody has as much environmental stress as first responders. And so, because of the nature of their job, they can't control that. It's not predictable. It's not in any way manageable. The tones go off at the fire station and you have to handle whatever is coming. We know that for that portion of relapse, CRF gets dumped in the amygdala, and the brain remembers the CRF and says, I guess I need to get some dopamine. And usually there's a great deal of cravings, if not actual use. As Cory talked about, suicide is super high among first responders. Substance use disorder is even higher. We know that roughly 10% of the population has a substance use disorder. We know that with any of the first responders, we're looking at double that amount. So 85% of career firefighters reported past months drinking, and reported 10 to 20 days a month, which corresponds to either half or all of their off-duty days. We know that twice as many firefighters in the United States die by suicide than in the line of duty. CBS News believes that only half of all firefighter suicides are actually reported. So we don't even have an accurate number. Also, we don't have an accurate number in terms of substance use overdose deaths. So depending on where you are, here in our county, for example, the medical examiner may not list something as suicide. He may list it as death by misadventure, or an accidental death, and not use the word suicide. So that skews the rates as well. 20 to 30% of police officers have substance use disorder. We know that 7 to 19 of these officers have diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. Many of them believe that they do not have it, and resent the idea that you might think that they do. However, they die from suicide, just like the firefighters, over twice than line of duty deaths. When the National Institute of Health studied 298 firefighters and 84 EMT suicides, they found that depression, sleep deprivation, PTSD, substance use were all playing a huge part. They also found that paramedics and EMTs have a higher rate of substance use, which they believe has to do with the access to very strong drugs in the back of an ambulance. They did not find any high rates of street type drugs. So they were making the assumption that it was that they had access to narcotics. Here at Starlite and the Harbor of Hope, the most commonly used substances for our first responders are, number one is nicotine, number two is alcohol, steroids, opioids, benzos, ADD, ADHD medications, cocaine, sleep medications, Lunesta, Ambien, Vistaril, methamphetamine, and if they have a history of military service and combat, a lot of them use Provigil, which is a drug that promotes wakefulness. And for special operators in the military, they often use Provigil to stay awake on missions. And that can be brought back into the civilian world. They convince a doctor that they fall asleep all the time. Next thing you know, they have a prescription for Provigil, and they're taking it quite often. We find that a lot of the signs, while they coincide with the non-first responder population, there are specific things to the first responder population. So somebody who was very active for their job, and the kind of officer or medic or firefighter that you could depend on for anything. Now there's anxiety, now there's depression, now there's really fluctuating energy levels, mood swings, aggravation, lying, missing important meetings, disappearing on duty. That's probably the one that I hear the most as a counselor, specifically from police officers, is that they started either using on duty or having relationships on duty, something that they would never do before the substance use really took hold of them. And that's when they knew that things were as bad as they could get. And I would say probably 50% of them were clear that they had been counseled about it. So the department already knew that there was a problem with sort of vanishing on duty, but they weren't sure what to do about it. Any of these concerns, from where I stand, is absolutely a reason to take action. So I wanted to give you a story about substance use disorder and PTSD and how deadly it really is. July 17th, 1987 was a Friday. Normal July in Texas, hot, muggy. Out of nowhere, a low pressure system developed over the North Fork of the Guadalupe River. This part of Texas is considered the most flood prone area in the United States. The South Fork of the river is one summer camp after the other. Most of the summer camps are, while they're on the river, the individuals are safe. One camp, it was their last day of camp, decided to go ahead and go on an outing. They were taking the flood route. And what they didn't know is that because the low pressure system had dumped 14 inches of rain in less than an hour, and they were looking at a wall of water about 30 feet, which was going to cover the flood route. And they would have been safer if they had stayed put. They did not stay put, tried to get out, and unfortunately, right when they rounded the curve, to actually get out of the flood route to the regular road, which would have taken them outside the backside of this ranch, the water hit them, and 43 people ended up in the river, and 33 were in extremely dangerous situations, to say the least. 2 adults out of those 43 were able to get out with the help of some standby folks. At probably 20 minutes after the call went out, there were 2 EMS crews there, numerous volunteer fire departments, one paid department, and the Department of Public Safety. It was still raining, and this was before we had things like Air Life. We had a news helicopter, and we were waiting on the DPS helicopter. However, the weather had gotten so bad, they were not willing to fly right at that moment. One of the EMS groups, a small department that was subsidized by the city and county of Kerrville and Kerr, had roughly 11 medics that were all under the age of 25. After this event, over time, there are now only 3 left alive. The rest have either died from suicide, substance use disorder, or a combination of both. So this is a situation that is as deadly as it comes. There was no critical incident stress debriefing back then. There were very few resources to get help. And unfortunately, leadership at the time didn't know how to access any of that. So I use this story just to illustrate how incredibly dangerous PTSD, substance use, and suicidal feelings can be when they're all mixed in together. We know that people can get better. People do recover at a fairly high rate. PTSD can go in remission. Here in our program, our modality of choice is EMDR. But if there's some reason that they cannot participate in EMDR, such as head injury, seizures, or the inability to regulate, we use CPT, which seems to help a lot. We use the SMART program. We expose them to AA. We try to do everything out of the box individually to reach somebody rather than a cookie cutter approach. Most cities have professional meetings so that officers, medics, dispatchers, lawyers, doctors, doesn't matter, can attend an AA meeting, for example, where they wouldn't be recognized necessarily. So there's really a lot of services out there, and if there aren't in your community, they can be started. Support is invaluable. Cory had mentioned several different organizations that work really hard to try to intervene on suicide, substance use disorder. I volunteer with the Code Green campaign. They do their best to intervene on any sort of mental health concern, any substance use disorder concern. If somebody is former military and they have VA benefits, they won't have to pay a dime for treatment because the VA will pay. If they have TRICARE, they can get into treatment easily. Departments are usually very good about allowing their members to seek treatment. I've been fortunate enough to work with 2 departments in particular in the last month, where their brass actually came down to visit the individuals. And we had family sessions, not with the individual's family, but with their chief, assistant chief, and a couple of members of their crew. I think we're starting to see a big turn in how these occupations see substance use disorder and PTSD and mental health concerns. Even if the department is doing it just for talent retention, I don't care why they do it, as long as they're doing it. Every life is valuable. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Eric, do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do. Actually, I just posted for the attendees to use the Q&A box down at the bottom for questions. But Cynthia asked, why is only half actually reported?
So what I read was because of the differences in how medical examiners, local coroners in Texas, for example, that's the justice of the peace. In the big cities, you have what you think of as a coroner, but in the small towns, it's a JP. And they are extremely reluctant to use the word suicide. And so we believe it has to do with small communities, the stigma to suicide, and a misguided way to protect the family is what it looks like. So that's the belief.
Awesome. Well, and I did get a few questions if we can have access to the both presentations, and we can do that. We can post it on our website and make it into a PDF, and we'll also have the recording available on YouTube, on our website, and on our Facebook page. So visit those. Let's see, Letitia said, what are the statistics as they relate to ethnic and or socioeconomic status?
So our statistics, we see more white officers, medics, firefighters, and African American. police officers, firefighters, and medics. And a relatively small percentage of Hispanic. Socioeconomic, a lot of them have lost their jobs. And so it really varies. I would say it's the entire gamut, usually for what we see. What do y'all see, Cory?
Yeah, it's very similar. Just in a general statistics speaking, of course, the white male is the vast majority of suicides we're losing on a regular basis. But one of the fastest growing demographic populations is the African American male. That's one of the fastest growing individuals we're losing to suicide right now. And then also Hispanic young women we're losing at a higher rate right now. Still statistically, they're much less than the white male, but they are growing at a much higher rate than the average white male. So that's a scary sign. That's a scary stat that we're seeing that start to trend up. As far as socioeconomic levels, we see a lot of the rural areas struggle a lot with suicide. A lot of it might be lack of resources, inability to access those resources that some of us have in more urbanized, more metro type of communities. So there definitely is a high risk and a high rate for those more rural populations. But like you said, it's something that really does not discriminate on socioeconomic, financial statuses, demographics, whatever you are. It's something that really touches all aspects of life. So that's why things like this are important to educate our communities the best we can, so that we all can be more knowledgeable on what to look out for.
Yeah, good point about the remote locations. In fact, Joe made a comment about the increase after the Uvalde shooting. And Melissa, you live pretty close to Uvalde, don't you?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Let's see. Someone else had a really good question about coping skills and resiliency training. What do you say, either of you, about techniques that the first responders could use for resiliency?
Melissa, I'll let you take that one. I'm sure you probably have better history with that.
Well, so we're seeing departments train better about resiliency and coping. They're doing a better job with that. And what used to be just an after action review, where they would sit down after a particularly bad call and discuss what went wrong, what could have gone better. And now they're discussing feelings about the call, which makes me happy because I never felt like the after action review was particularly effective in terms of what our subject today. While people are inpatient with us, we work a lot on coping skills. Probably the number one is call somebody, talk to somebody. And it doesn't matter who, but if you need to talk to somebody that understands, call us. There are all sorts of organizations that will help out if you want anonymity. There's some really good therapists out there that can help walk somebody through everything that they're going through. But you have to talk about it. Your mind is a bad neighborhood. Do not go up there alone after you've had a bad event. you need somebody to walk you to your car.
Yeah. I know the FBI curriculum for resiliency talks a lot about gratitude, mindfulness, meditation, and for a lot of first responders, they may initially think that's kind of silly, but so a lot of studies show that it actually greatly helps, and even helps heal the brain from PTSD and trauma.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Here's another good question, and Cory, someone's asking about other presentations that you do for different other groups. And I know a lot of that's on your website. Tell us about the other programs that you do.
Absolutely. We do a lot of training with educators. We do in-service training with teachers, youth workers, training them to recognize their students who might be struggling. We do training with youth. We have curriculum that we have developed for young people, training them to recognize a friend who might be struggling. We have training for coaches and athletic personnel on how to develop a system of encouraging mental health for your athletes, which is an area that is struggling since the pandemic. We have general community presentations, whether that's presentations for parents, presentations with faith groups, civic groups, whatever it may be. We do trainings for general populations as far as all age groups on suicide statistics. But our specialty and main focus is typically that youth and young adult population, as well as our first responder trainings that we do. So quite a few trainings virtually live, but we do have 14 training modules on our website that you can access for free. And those cover all subjects related to suicide prevention, from bullying and suicide, supporting LGBTQ students in schools, non-suicidal self-injury, a lot of different topics related to the issue that if you're interested, you can really gain a well-rounded knowledge of the topic.
Awesome. Well, we got some good questions too. Well, let me ask Melissa the same question. I know you have some programs at Starlite that are kind of overlapping. Tell us about the other programs there at Starlite.
So we have a veteran specific program. They are separated from the main population, and we work on PTSD, moral injury, combat, attachment, reintegration. We help them understand the VA system and how to get involved. We also have the Journey program, which is a Christian-based recovery program. We have the Freedom program, which addresses all of our LGBTQ folks that come to see us. And hopefully very soon we're going to have an opioid specific program. If you've got a need, we can pretty much address it for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. And yeah, it's amazing how those are specific separate programs, but then yet a lot of times they overlap. It's amazing. Let's see, Cory, Dr. McFarland had an interesting question about, do you think that suicide pacts among younger people are on the rise?
So we can't put a statistic showing that they're on the rise. We do hear about them. This kind of goes into kind of a cluster as well, clusters and contagions that you hear about, or packs. You hear about social media trends about, hey, this is going to be suicide day, and things like that. We hear about those often. We haven't necessarily seen a rise in them. We're hearing about them more often, not necessarily putting statistics to it. We actually just did a training last year on suicide contagions and clusters, which talks about suicide packs, talks about the contagion aspect of suicide, the cluster aspect, where often you see a suicide and you think, hey, it's their closest friends that are going to be most likely to have a struggle with suicide, where in fact a lot of times we'll see that maybe that individual that has had some contact with them, maybe a passerby. So we have a 1-hour module that talks specifically about contagions and clusters and does bring up the issue of suicide packs. But we haven't necessarily seen it statistically on the rise, but we have seen it being talked about through social media more often than in years past.
Yeah, good old social media. Thomas is asking, I guess, for either of you, how often are first responders recommended to take trainings for coping, trauma-informed care, suicide prevention, that kind of thing?
So in small departments, that is probably an unusual thing for them to be asked to take. However, since the unbelievable outbreak in school shootings, I think it is on the rise. Larger departments are much better at doing in-house training on especially resiliency and focusing on coping skills, and not just for the first responder themselves, but how they could help somebody else that they're going to encounter. We know that mental health officers or mental health specialists are way on the rise, even in smaller towns. So their role is to check on people who have mental health struggles that they know about, and then intervene when needed. And I'm talking about towns that are maybe 2,000 population. So that's kind of exciting for me to see.
I will say, just here locally, here in Nashville, I know that a lot of departments have required almost like continuing education training that they have to do on an annual basis. And I know there's specific trainings they have to do, but I think there's a certain amount of hours that they kind of have elective that the departments can choose what they want their officers to have. I have been working with the Nashville Fire and EMS Training Center here locally, doing trainings with them. I've done a couple here in the last few months, where they will have continuing education days where they'll have the first responders come in, fire and EMS, and do trainings. And in fact, I did one a couple of months ago where I went into the training center and they were doing a birthing class, for EMS doing a birthing class. And then I was their next training on suicide prevention for their fellow first responders. So it was quite funny. But so I think a lot of it's kind of regional and department based. So just being able to offer them this training, we have this training on DVD that, we can send out to departments that they can stream it live. And it's kind of elective, but in a lot of instances, they may be able to count this towards their continuing education that they're required to do. So, it might just be as far as them knowing that it's available.
Awesome. And I did just post or put in the chat, our next webinar is going to be on the resilient recovery, grow through what you go through. And so we have been talking a little bit about the addiction treatment and the importance of resiliency on that. And this is for anybody that's going through addiction treatment, that they need to get ensure a sober lifestyle. So register for that. There's a link I just posted. And also for those questions, we are going to get an email tomorrow. And after you finish this webinar, you're going to get a link to our evaluation on our website. So fill that evaluation and you can print off the certificate of completion for your CEU credit. Now, I know sometimes things happen and technology or security systems prevent that from getting printed, and that's okay. Just email us and we'll send that out to you. Any last words, Cory?
I really appreciate the opportunity, being able to speak with this audience and share suicide prevention resources and just help raise awareness that, there's an issue that we're struggling with in our nation, but it's an issue that we can make a significant impact on. So again, one of the leading causes of preventable death. So we have a really encouraging future of how we can make a difference in this issue. So really appreciate the opportunity to share that with you today.
Man, thank you for what you do. And I guess this is the third year we've had you on one of our webinar series. So
yeah, absolutely. Love it. Love it. Hope for many more.
Yeah. And Melissa, any last words about your new program?
So this new program is a dream come true. And the more people we can reach with the information, the better. So it's super exciting for me to be involved. And I just can't think of a better way to reach out to folks than, of course, electronic media. If you can't get to standard training, this is the way to do it. And I'm so grateful that so many people showed up.
This is awesome. So if anybody on the webinar has either a first responder or someone that needs help with addiction and needs to go off to a residential program, we do have an admissions team that's actually available 24/7. And we take just about all insurance, including the military insurance, TRICARE. A big majority of our first responders are veterans, and we can handle that as well. So just look us up on the website, starlightrecovery.com, and also stay tuned for other great webinars that we have coming up in the future. So that just about concludes our webinar for today. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Melissa and Cory. Great presentation today. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, take care.